assume it's just going to be something that's kind of silly. And when it gets to the point of the one guy wearing the dark clothes, hitting, it's really funny because I have met Larry Jordan. I don't really know him well, but the guy who gets whacked, it's really funny to see him as like a 20-year-old, because I only knew him as at least 50 or 60. Anyway, when he gets whacked, you know, it's kind of, he cuts away from it, but it's kind of shocking, I have to say. It's sort of like, you see all this sort of overwrought artiness to the film, and then all of a sudden, wow, this really matters in a weird way. What I took away from the film that I related, the only thing, I've only seen of Rosemary Strachel's video work, the only things I've seen are the Manu series. And this was very much like, I could take the more adventurous female character as having a weird relationship to Manu, like in Manu #1. That there was something about her independence. I mean, it's here, you know, she's like basically cast as Pandora, you know, and the other one is sort of Cassandra. He's thinking sort of big Greek tragedy sort of terms, but the way she flips it around, I mean, I think her reading of the film, you know, in terms of like sort of gender politics, I think is just astonishingly brilliant. It's probably, her reading of the film is probably better than the film is itself. You know, like what she took away from it, and what she did, and the way she managed to sort of invent Manu as a character, which is, you know, she's not that kind of person, but she figures out, she recognizes that woman, she recognizes her as a kind of, I mean, this is all imaginary, of course, I have no idea what she's thinking, but my reading is that, you know, she sees in her this kind of independent person, but being read in this really weird way, in a very sort of typical, you know, horribly stereotypical kind of way. And she takes her and sort of just makes her a live human being who's just kind of somewhat indifferent, kind of adventurous. And, you know, she lays down in the grave in the Manu #1.
Keith's talking about Manu, the main character of a series of videos called Manu's Spleen 1 through 4, or
1 through
5. And there was a part of an exhibition at DIA in 2002 called Manu, called Spleen, actually. Spleen. And really the last institutional exhibition that Strachel has had in New York. And it was a video, primarily video-based exhibition that had a kind of these architectural walls that broke up the space, and that had these sort of architectonic plates that were very sensitive to movement as you pass them. And then on the back side of each of these walls were these different chapters or episodic chapters of this character Manu in various scenarios. And that idea of spleen, though, I think is sort of central, because the idea of spleen being something that in the exhibition, in Strachel's exhibition, both like if you go back far enough, it's the place of like common connection and love in a way. And then it came to be known as more so what we think of as spleen, as a kind of place of jealousy, envy, cruelty, and kind of the things we sort of associate with violent response or anger. And that, in a weird way, both the Strachel exhibition certainly played off of both of those ideas of spleen, and in a strange way, this film, I mean, I certainly was thinking about that idea of a kind of primal animal kind of conceits. They unfold in this dream space of like envy, competition, you know, desire, and they unfold in this sort of pantomime way. But then there is a weird thing about the violence. The violence kind of supersedes or has an excess in the film, the Brakhage film, that in a way oddly steps out of the film, and you're a little bit surprised.
I think violence for me is an interesting idea to think across the two films also, and I mean that's maybe a very personal place to start, but for me the Brakhage is much easier and also more pleasurable to watch than the Pasolini, and I'm interested in how like that maps out the psychological space, and then you have that other space of social critique in Pasolini, and to have those two references here tonight I think is really interesting. because I mean, I was intrigued by the invitation to be here and respond to the films, because I think it's really interesting for me to almost to have this glimpse over Rosemary Truckle's shoulder without, you know, exactly knowing what she's doing, but then at the same time being invited to kind of see things that are interesting or important to her. And one question that's really interesting to me in relation to her work is like that place of research, or the place of conceptual thinking within the practice that is so open and rigorous at the same time. And I think along those lines, I thought both films were really interesting, but I was more drawn to the kind of drama of the Brakhage. And really interested at first because I thought maybe I was invited also, that's just me trying to figure out what I'm doing here. I was like, oh, I'm paying attention to gender, and then I was like, no, I'm actually not so interested in that in this. I think the film is much more about sexuality than it is about gender. And it's really about the heterosexual drama played out in this like horror film conceit. And then I got really interested in the figure of the reader, that guy who kind of holds the place of culture, and he's kind of the guy who has like the mediated relationship to drama. Like for him, it happens on the page. He doesn't get in there.
Yeah.
And I think that relationship to culture again is something that we can talk about in relation to both of the films.
Yeah, and
that's
the
really
cultured figure leaves the building, so to speak,
Yeah.
and leaves, in a sense, leaves the drama to unfold in a way, in a kind of the dark, in the shadows, so to speak, or certainly in a kind of like darker kind of register. But and gender is an interesting question in the films, because that wasn't why I invited you. So.
Yeah, it's also nice to know.
But also, it's an interesting question because Truckle's work has art historically often been put in a sort of frame of gendered work, or that it is representative of a certain kind of reading of gender. And of course, it's very involved in questions of gender and also role playing but it is all at the same time, and social readings of kind of gender positions, but it's very much also about this kind of like these kinds of like much more basic human drives, or you could even call them psychoanalytic if you decided to take that guise, but very much so also a social background. I mean, and I think that's one thing interesting to think about in relationship to both films, is that Truckle is not a German artist per se. She's a West German artist. I mean, she's born in 1952, and is in a sense is raised in that period of the German economic miracle, which had a kind of forgetting, in a sense, of obvious kind of traumas and on historic kind of sense of guilt and shame. But in a way, this is her childhood and her adolescence, and you see it time and time again in the things in her work. This kind of sense of a moment of development, or passing through a kind of stage of human development, and returning to it in various ways, both in the kind of the role of the child, the role of the authority figure, the kind of the role of the fool. And what was interesting, I think, is in these films is you have a kind of affinity to films, I think, that do have a kind of very self-aware, in very different ways, self-aware relationship to post-war culture. Certainly in Brakhage and unquestionably in Pasolini, I mean, which we can get into in a little bit. But even in the Brakhage film, it's hard to really see that as not a kind of socially aware sort of film in a way. But I don't know what you think of that.
There's definitely a disconnect from social, the typical way a feature film would be made. But at that point in his career, I wonder how conscious the disconnect really is. I mean, clearly these are not characters that we're going to see in a typical Hollywood film. We're not going to see these kind of college-age intellectuals out for a drive, and who get lost, the car breaks down and that sort of thing. But it is very much a genre situation. And he probably shot it as silent because sync sound equipment in 1953 would just be impossibly expensive. You'd have to shoot 35, and it would be very, very hard to make a sync sound film at that time. So, in a way, he's at a distance from the institution, but I'm not sure how it would, you know, he's probably written about it somewhere, and I don't know where, but I basically see somebody who's 20 years old trying to make the best film of this genre that they possibly can, and that's what he came up with. My own fantasy is that the guy with the book is reading, and I know it's the Modern Library Edition because I recognize the logo. It's like he's reading the Modern Library Edition of War and Peace in the Constance Garnett translation.
Do you, that sense of pantomime, though, in a way, that it does relate to, say, a G.W. Pabst or Fritz Lang or these kinds of like German filmmakers to some degree. But you can see it in the Brakhage film too, a kind of use of some, as you mentioned it, some of these kinds of like pantomime gestures and scenarios and scenes. But I do think, I mean, I would say the ambition is toward making a film that is not, that is also kind of like, has a kind of alienated, or say, at least at the very least, a kind of like melancholy kind of relationship to the idea of this leisure, even, or America, kind of active leisure. I mean, it's this, you know, place of former fabrication. It's like obviously was some sort of mine or something, and the way it unfolds with these just very subtle but actually kind of interesting, where one character leaves and is not part of it. So in a sense, he's like absolved, and then the others sort of choose to, at various points, peel off from the kind of, in some ways, call it like the inevitable violence and the kind of, you know, almost mythological kind of representation of it. But then it does, so it has these subtleties as opposed to kind of just sort of funny or just kind of, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, there's definitely I mean, he's by both choice and necessity, he's reinventing a silent film aesthetic.
Yeah.
And he is filtering it through, you know, sort of Hollywood and the sort of the German expressionist migration to Hollywood.
Yeah.
But he's definitely looking back further than that. I mean, those shots of the guys inside the mine with a little, you know, sort of stippled light on them are right out of Battleship Potemkin.
Yeah.
And he's clearly much more interested in how they look in that light than he is in, you know, he gets kind of really carried away in a kind of amazing way. When the guy falls down the, you know, when the sort of the bad guy protagonist finally falls, it's very much like, you know, the opening of the bridge in October, where time is expanded. He doesn't, it's not so much creating an illusion of continuity or a match on action or something like that. He's definitely consciously going the other way to kind of extend that flight, to give us kind of a sensation of falling there.
Yeah.
And the way he kind of repeats himself and overlaps the shot is very much in the mode of Eisenstein.
Yeah, I mean, and that idea of a kind of, or to Eisenstein's phrase, a montage of attractions, the notion that you kind of, by bringing things together with a certain amount of tension in their proximity, that you create a kind of psychological space, or a kind of, call it a kind of affective space. But in this film, and then clearly, like Brakhage, which we've seen, the Brakhage we think of, the kind of non-narrative abstract filmmaker, you have a kind of ocular, specular, surface material obsession that is even at play in this film, with a lot of the kind of like the moments where it starts to become vertiginous or a little bit altered, the altered states.
Yeah.
And I thought that sense of the kind of ocular or specular kind of fascination, that's to me where I imagine Trunkle being most like interested, is this idea of like a kind of sort of, as she said in some, and Anthony has pointed out as a meaningful phrase, this idea of beauty without the gloss. So in a sense, something that gains material presence and has a kind of affective immediacy, but is also sort of departs at the moment of becoming something representative or figurative or something like that. And in this film, I felt like that was what made the film so, that made it go further into, registered in a different way, were exactly those kind of ideas of motion, mediated vision, kind of ocular, specular experimentation.
And we're totally set up for that already by the title, right? What is it, Glassless?
It's a terrible title. Unglassed windows.
Cast a
Unglassed
terrible
windows
reflection.
cast a terrible
I
reflection.
think it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
wonderful or terrible.
And I think
Stop, you're both right.
it's really amazing how it sets you up already for like the window that's unglassed, something is broken between the inside and the outside, and the moment, like the shots where that actually appears, the the windows, whether they lay on the ground or whether they are what like cuts into the image, are really significant moments in that film, and kind of also heighten all the other formal decisions and all the abstraction that you're talking about. Is kind of, you're already set up, but that is already also that formal decision is deeply embedded. It's at the center of what the drama actually is.
Yeah.
And that I think is really brilliant. But then I was just also wondering, and I don't know, did Rosemary pair these two films? No, you paired them.
Yeah.
Because the way in which the cross then appears in the second film, I was like, that's kind of really interesting and strange, and I don't know if I want to make something out of that. But you know, you have that cross shape.
I think they were. I paired them.
Two caves.
Well, yeah, I paired them because of the sense of.
I mean, it's like two caves, right?
Yeah.
There's the kind of landscape, big, you know, when they're driving around, they're in these big, you know, the sky is big, the mountains are, and this is like nature. And then the inside dark kind of cave space is the place of like hallucination, basically, or not hallucination, but we're just something, something about that sublime nature of the world becomes.
Body horror, hunger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like,
And excess, like things go awry inside the structure.
Inside the structure.
I mean, I was really also, I don't know so much about horror films, but I know that there usually is a scream. So from the beginning, I was waiting for the scream, and I was like, okay, you know, it's a silent film. And I thought that it had sound in it. I mean, the street sounds were great, but there was, I don't know if other people felt the same way, but I thought that there was a lot of sound thinking in that film, like particularly right after they get out of the car when the can is kicked. I could hear that. Like, you know, there's a lot of moments where you hear it, even though it's a silent film. But then, of course, that moment of the scream comes, and that's when the book drops. Like, that's kind of what ruptures the surface of that kind of culture distance to drama that you know. So, and I think that's in, like, and then you have to figure out Orson Welles in the second film, the director. So I think it is very much, both films are also about the place of the producer and production and consumption of culture. It's like going on in both of them in really interesting ways.
Yeah, I don't think that you get to, you can't really get to Rosemary Trockel by just the brackage. Because the one thing that's different about her work is that it has that deflationary aspect that Pasolini has. Pasolini stages it in a certain kind of way, and this is probably the most staged kind of hyper-framed film he ever did. His other films have a kind of diffidence almost towards framing, and he always, like the last shot of a Pasolini film is always disappointing. It's always disappointing. It's like, this guy is like so brilliant, and then just the edit is just wrong. It just ends the wrong amount of time. And I think it's purposeful, but it's very upsetting. It's very irritating. And I think that I think she takes away, you know, the aesthetic strategies. You know, she does her own thing with them. But that sort of deflationary aesthetic, the Brechtian aspect to it, which you have here, you need that. You know, you can't. It's not just one or the other. It's if you take these two and you kind of synthesize, then you approach something like the complexity of her sensibility.
Yeah, and her ideas of installation. I mean, the sense of confinement. I mean, even from early works that used sort of these vitrine structures often, and a sense, a kind of, certainly a relationship to, say, boys, and this kind of idea of the ethnographic assembly or something, through to like a more recent show where you see this kind of idea of like a kind of arm's length distance to these things you really want to get close to, through this idea of a Wunderkammer, to the collages, which have a kind of, again, a kind of like both corporeal, or you could call it psychoanalytic refusal of like body, affect, eyes, limbs, contorted limbs, but also a sort of social reading that is, I think, about alienation. But a question I wanted to ask to the audience, but also to you guys, was that Trockel has talked about this idea of Brecht's, she's obsessed with Brecht, as well as many other figures, and like, including Pasolini and others. But her take on Brecht, which I think is very interesting, and I've been obsessing about and kind of extending a little bit, is that she says the notion of a didactic informative rupture is no longer available to us.
Right.
And that we do not have that relationship with genre, we do not have that relationship to narrative, and we don't have that relationship to history. That's my take on one. She didn't really say that, but I mean,
but I think she says something pretty close.
Similar to that, and so in a weird way, she's obsessed with Brecht, but she's also saying that where does kind of a non-available didactic, where does that get you? And I think that's when it comes into this sort of, you have to pull from the sort of embodied, the kind of affective, the not only sexual and gendered, but even down to like envy and like competition, as well as this kind of maybe more Pasolini-esque kind of idea of collapsing genre forms and things, both a kind of love for genre and a knowledge that it is completely corrupted.
Well, Manu number 4. I mean, when she has Manu doing the Brigitte Bardot bit from Contempt with the black wig on, it's really incredible.
Yeah.
And those her sons with those really hilarious bodysuits on and those little silk penises.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just, wow. They're like that. That is a go-go boy. You know, they are like. It's not, you know, we're not talking about King Tut's Wawa Hut or the East Village in the 80s, but those are so, their kind of emasculation or the reduction is so, to me, and again, other people take other things about it, it's such a telling, like, access to how women have been represented in those, you know, if they were in the same role. And this sort of really, I mean, they're just like, wow, it's really intense.
This is a part of the Spleen exhibition that takes up Mother Courage, the play by Brecht that was done pre and post-war versions, actually, interestingly, and that idea of Mother Courage with the convoy, so to speak, and the kind of cruelty of Mother Courage to some degree. In this film, she takes it and animates it into a 7-minute video, but it has all these, like, Brigitte Bardot is there, Jackie Onassis is there, Jeanne d'Arc is there, and then these kind of like ridiculous, permanently erect, like assistant characters are there, and they kind of enact this sort of, in a way, I think very much what her take on Brecht is a sort of, here is a gathering together of a parodic relationship to genre. What does that do? And I mean, I feel like she's asking that consistently in her work, and I would say that's a very charged political and formal kind of both, really kind of approach.
But yeah, but I think the question is, what does that do in terms of social political engagement? Like, where does that put someone or her as an artist and as a producer of like objects and things that will have meaning in the world? And I think that's a really, really interesting question in relation to both films tonight. Like how to get things across, like how to, you know, and how
embody this kind of paradox too.
And how, and how to involve an audience, because I think both of these films do that in a really strong way, but also in really different ways.
Yeah, and again, it's that deflationary aspect to the Manu series. It's like her films almost exist in indifference to us. They don't really care that we're watching them in some weird way. And her sense of genre is way, way different than Pasolini. I mean, Pasolini is like lasered in on this, you know, very specific sort of genre of the Christ film, and then, you know, some other sort of, you know, Italian neorealism and stuff. But she just like lets it go. She's just like, okay, let's have, you know, this is the stuff I like. I think it goes together. Let's just make a really imaginative experiment.
I don't agree with that. Yeah.
Well, I think it's very wide open. I think that hers is much more unresolved, and it's much more complex. In some ways, it's not so, you know, targeted. It's targeted, but her way, it's not like, you know, it's not like shooting a gun at something. It's like it's an exploded view of a field, and it goes in a lot of different directions. And that way that her work has of making these sort of networked connections is, that's what's engrossing about it. that she's putting together elements which could be otherwise thought of as extremely disparate. It's not just like two things. Okay, we have high and low. We have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It's never like that. And the social aspect of her work is, you know, I can see, you know, people that were very sort of simple-minded politically saying that it's not political enough, when in fact I think it's extremely complex politically, both in terms of sort of, you know, conventional meanings of politics and in terms of gender politics.
Yeah.
I think she takes a lot of risks in both those fields.
Well, it's interesting because there's from a work like that is like got kind of, maybe not as well known, but like her collaboration with Karsten Haller, these houses for animals, but a house for pigs and humans and pigs, basically, pigs and humans, at Documenta, created this very kind of like, I don't know, very, like basically a kind of viewing platform for humans that would have, where the pigs couldn't see the humans, and the pigs would just see the reflecting response, and they were in a pen, and so it played with so many of these ideas of, say, structure and like what architecture means, what the violence of say architecture means toward an animal or a human. And I mean, in some ways, from like a petting zoo to like the gas chamber, everything is at play in that piece. But when you look at her work proper, like say in the Spleen exhibition, there's some sort of like, there is a kind of like holding on to this kind of, I think you're right, like much more open, networked, like almost parceled approach to aesthetics, so as opposed to sort of didactic, which I think the houses for animals are pretty didactic.
I think they're very, I mean, you know, it's pigs. There's a kind of cartoon-like thing to that. There's a sense of parody. I mean, here we are watching these two stories of death, basically, right? These are two films where people die in the end, and yet everyone's laughing throughout both films, and I think that kind of marriage of cruelty and violence and parody and kind of how that as a technique to try to do something to genre and what genre does to the way that you can construct a world and the way you can tell a story is this kind of interesting device that I think she also uses throughout the work.
But I also thought that in relation to thinking about genre, the idea of reinvention, I mean, it's more than repurposing, but it seems to be a real reinvention that's at stake in both of these films. Specifically also in how the Pasolini culture is broken and religion is broken. Yeah. None of those serve like the people. And that gets totally broken down throughout that whole film, and something else gets reinvented along that process. So it's a process of taking apart and like destruction and construction at the same time, and I think that idea is also a really strong one, thinking about how those two filmmakers could be models in terms of being artists in the world.
Yeah, and in Pasolini, I mean, this film is also made after Mama Roma, after Actone, in the same shanty sort of suburbs of Rome, like the Borgate or whatever, where all those characters are coming from to try and get the food on the set, you know? This is where he shot those films, and also where he brings these kinds of poses, these allegorical poses and gestures to bear on a kind of exposed, I would say hyper-Brechtian. I don't think it's Brechtian. I don't even know what you call it. It's Pasolini. But a kind of approach that got him so far into trouble that, you know, within 10 years he was arguably murdered for it. So, meaning there's a kind of like, in that Pasolini film you feel this, I mean, it's funny, it's so entertaining, and even Orson Welles' role is so awesome. I mean, he's just perfect at it. He does it without, it's like as though he's no effort to play that character in a very specific way as a parody of Pasolini himself. But in the end, you feel like that film is like angry and going after, has targets, and is like moving forward with a kind of vendetta, to use a Trockle word that she likes, this idea of vendetta. And I guess I was wondering about that idea, is like how to use not only parody, but that's the word I keep using, like to think about her work, but a kind of, even into the realm of satire, comedy, cruelty, this idea of vendetta as a formal device.
One thing I think it's important to remember is that she said there are no models.
Yeah.
You know, you can't follow a model. Yeah. Models can only take you so far, and she means that when she said it at first, I mean, I knew what she meant, but I could also, since it's so much about particular characters, it's almost model in the way that Bresson uses that word to refer to actors. That's the word he uses. He doesn't talk about them as actors, he talks about them as models.
Right.
And in fact, I know she's interested in Bresson because she has a piece which is, it's a parody of, what do you call it? In English it's called A Man Escaped.
Yeah.
But in German, she makes this funny playback to the French title, which is Un condamné à mort s'est échappé, which is a man condemned to death has escaped, or escaped. But what she says is a person, I think it's a man, I can't remember the gender, but she says something like, well, what it amounts to is a man or a person condemned to life escapes.
That's great. Maybe that's a good, because that's a really great opening to like see if there's some questions, because in a way, like, also Trockel's relationship, she actually, it is true, one of the filmmakers we were talking about was, of course, Bresson, and we're going to show a Fassbinder film in 2 weeks that is just the most brutal of Fassbinder's films in a way.
Which one would that be?
In a Year with 13 Moons. It's like very hardcore film.
It's hardcore, yeah.
But a great film. So in a weird, and next week we're going to look at Brian De Palma, and Brian De Palma's early really double films. We're going to watch the first one, which is called Greetings, which takes up the kind of Vietnam War, civil rights, like everything going on in the States through a very particular, peculiar version of, say, new wave influences, but through Brian De Palma, which wind up getting you into much more trouble, I think, than maybe Godard got himself into in some ways. But so those are the kinds of films that she's put forward as related to her own practice, and in this kind of really kind of polyvalent, but also even like this sort of a kind of perverse pleasure in paradox and in sort of formally and even maybe politically, I think, or socially tinged. That it's interesting to think about how that relates to her position as a woman artist in Germany, and also at that time in Cologne, and even in relationship to some of the kind of predominant register of artists that she was really influenced by, like I was mentioning, Boys, for instance. That this sense of her way around some of the kind of antagonistic, like in terms of I'm against you kind of thing, involves some of these tactics that it also, you would have to say, are resonant in Pasolini, for instance, and so forth. But they get you even in more trouble in a weird way. It certainly got Pasolini in more trouble. I mean, he was telling these kinds of allegorical films where people wanted to kill him. But anyway, are there yes, Maxwell?
Yeah, when watching those, I kept thinking about these kinds of these really obvious mediations